So the second day of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to Russia for his high-powered meeting with President Vladimir Putin has happened today. In fact, the two leaders are right now in the middle of their major bilateral discussions. This is really the business end of the meeting. But today has been a really busy day for the Prime Minister in terms of his diplomatic schedule. So let's walk you through what he has been up to today. So first of all, he started by meeting members of the Indian diaspora in Moscow. He sort of made a speech to them, talked about a number of issues, met very distinguished members of the Indian diaspora there. He, of course, made a speech where he focused on really two different themes. First of all, he talked about how inspiring India's journey of change has been over the last 10 years since he, of course, became Prime Minister. He's talked about, he pointed to events like the Chandrayaan moon landings. He's talked about India's growing economy, its aspirations of becoming the world's third largest economy as a sort of course, to talk about India's growth, but of course to talk about his government's record as well in office. So he's talking up to the Indian diaspora. He sort of said that, in the last 10 years, India has really arrived on the world stage. People respect India a lot more. And he referred to the Indian diaspora and said that, because of the efforts of people like you as well, India's standing on the world stage has greatly improved. So, one part of his remarks to the Indian diaspora talking about how much India has progressed, but then he, of course, turned to his host, Russian President Vladimir Putin, talking about how much the Russian president had contributed to the bilateral relationship and also referring to Russia and also talking to Russia about things like how important the friendship between the two countries is, talking about the fact that the two countries are sukh dukh ke sathi, which means, of course, all weather friends, I suppose you'd say in English. So really saying something that is often said about India and Russia in their bilateral relationship. So that was his meeting with the Indian diaspora, which happened earlier today. He then, of course, went on to the tomb of the unknown soldier in Russia. This is a very important military memorial, which is, of course, for the fallen soldiers of Russia in their various wars, especially World War II. It's become a very important national memorial for Russia and for Russians generally. So he went there, he laid a wreath in a way that many foreign dignitaries do when they come to India as well. So many Indian dignitaries come to Rajghat and then lay a wreath as well. So Prime Minister Modi also going to the tomb of the unknown soldier and sort of laying a wreath there. So after that, he, of course, moved on, and now we've had some of the other major conversations with President Putin. That's what the focus is going to be now today, the bilateral talks between the two leaders. Right now, of course, just maybe a couple of minutes ago, he finished making his opening remarks. President Putin will make his opening remarks. Then the two men will head in for a restricted sort of meeting between just the two of them. Then, of course, there'll be a wider meeting between the two the delegations, the Indian delegation as well as the wider Russian delegation. And then, of course, you will have other events playing out through the day, which will, of course, also include the Prime Minister around 4 p.m. Moscow time, so around 6:30 India time. He will be heading off to Austria, which is of course, his next destination. But let's also just talk about a little bit about what the Prime Minister is expected to speak about with President Putin. So the people we're speaking to in the ministry are sort of saying, in the Ministry of External Affairs, are sort of saying that there are really 3 or 4 big takeaways that the Prime Minister wants to focus on. Number one, he wants to focus on energy supply from Russia. You will know that Russia has been one of the biggest suppliers of energy, cheap energy to India over the last couple of years, especially since the Ukraine war ended. India has this massive dependence on foreign energy for running its economy. So India has approximately 85 to 90% of its energy demands are met from outside when it comes to energy and oil. And Russia has become really India's top oil supplier because after the war in Ukraine, it offered its energy and its oil on much lower prices than other international competitors, which meant that Indian industry went out and bought a lot of Russian oil. In fact, the India-Russia trade relationship is now at $65 billion. That puts Russia at just about in India's top 5 trade partners. Before that, Russia was India's 25th largest trade partner. So all of that happened, this massive change from 25th to 5th happened in the course of just a couple of years, mostly on the back of oil sales. So the Prime Minister is obviously going to talk to the Russian president about maintaining the stability of those supplies. They're also going to talk about fertilizer. Russia is a major supplier of fertilizer to India, and of course for the Indian farmers, that is incredibly important in terms of their production process. So you're going to have some conversations about that, making sure that there is a stability of supply around these things. There are lots of conversations about how supply chains, economic supply chains for these critical inputs have been so disrupted after the war in Ukraine. It's something you hear time and time again. Supply chains, something that I'm sure most of us didn't hear about before the war in Ukraine and the pandemic, but over the last couple of years has become an absolutely vital focus of economic security. And so the Prime Minister is expected to raise that. A big focus will also be Ukraine, which is, of course, the Prime Minister has already made, if you've cared to glance at the headlines today in terms of your phone, what's been happening, he's already talked about, the Prime Minister has conveyed this message, there are going to be no solutions found on the battlefield. So 2 years ago, you had Prime Minister Modi coming out and making this big statement telling President Putin of Russia that this is not an era of war. 2 years later, he comes in and says there are no solutions to be found on the battlefield. There must be diplomacy and dialogue. So this is, of course, the Prime Minister trying to fall back on India's reputation for trying to mediate conflicts and trying to as being a friendly voice, telling Russia that the conflict in Ukraine needs to end because of its destabilizing impact on the just the global economy and global politics as a whole. So that's going to be so that has been a big discussion. He in fact during his opening remarks, he spoke very candidly about the fact that the suffering that the war has caused to ordinary individuals, and how all sides have to come together to end this this conflict in Ukraine that has been going on for around 2.5 years now. So the Prime Minister again making that diplomatic push to bring an end to the conflict. So that is a significant development as well. So these are some of the major issues that the Prime Minister has discussed. Of course, another big issue that in fact got resolved earlier this morning was the issue of Indians fighting for Russia's military. For those of you who may not know about this, what happened was that a couple of months ago you had a major news story break where it was reported that dozens of Indians had actually been trafficked and taken to Russia to fight for the Russian military. They're in fact been told that they would be working in safe jobs, in lucrative jobs with safe conditions. But in fact, when they were taken there by their visa agents, they actually found out that they were victims of a human trafficking ring. And these agents then took away their passports and forced them to fight for Russia's military in Ukraine, which was not at all what they had signed up to do. And very tragically, 4 of these Indians were killed. Several have been discharged. The Foreign Secretary Vinay Quatra just a couple of days ago estimated that the number of Indians fighting for the Russian military was around 35 to 50. That it was just a rough estimate, and he admitted that it was just a rough estimate. But getting them discharged has been an absolute priority for the Indian government. In fact, the Indian government, in fact, you don't see them criticize Russia much, but they actually put out a very, very strong statement just a couple of days and weeks ago that they absolutely wanted all Indians fighting for Russia's military to be discharged. And they said that, look, this is not in line with India's established strategic partnership with Russia, which is a rare sort of criticism of Russia, which you don't very much see. But the Prime Minister, of course, raised that, and I think Russia has recognized that India takes this very seriously. So they have committed to getting all Indians who have been placed in these situations fighting for Russia's military to be discharged and out of any danger. So that's also going to be extremely important in terms of their conversations. But that was already a win that you saw the two countries have earlier in the day. So now we're also going to talk a little bit about, we've talked about the substantive part of the discussions, what the two countries are going to be focusing on. We also expect there'll be some conversations about defense. That's, of course, also going to be an important part of the relationship, always has been. Prime Minister Narendra Modi also announcing that India is going to open up 2 new consulates in Russia, so that will expand India's diplomatic representation there. So really some interesting news has been coming out in terms of the India-Russia relationship. What you're going to have, of course, is once the leaders finish their bilateral meeting, you will have an exchange of documents typically, and once that exchange of documents is done, you also have a sense of what the major takeaways were. So either the two sides might do a press statement, or there might be a press briefing, and that will allow us to understand what has transpired in these talks, what both sides have communicated to each other, what they've got out of this. So that's what we have in terms of the substantive talks. After this, of course, the Prime Minister is going to wrap up what we talked about in terms of the exchange of notes and so on, and then he's of course going to head off to Austria later in the day. But let's also talk about, we've talked about this Russia meeting. Let's also talk a little bit about what the international reactions have been. You have the American government has weighed in on this meeting by Prime Minister Modi to visit by Prime Minister Modi to Russia. In fact, State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller actually talked about how America has raised its concerns with India on its relationship with Russia in the past. This was in response to a question about India's relations with Russia. I think we have that clip for you, and we're just going to play that very, very briefly.
Good afternoon, everyone.
There's another visitor in Moscow today, Prime Minister Modi of India. Obviously India has a long-standing relationship with Russia. What do you think of the timing of this right before the NATO summit and in light of what's going on?
Yeah, so again, we did just see Modi, like Orban, meet with President Zelensky. We thought that was an important step to take. And we would urge India, as we do any country when it engages with Russia, to make clear that any resolution to the conflict in Ukraine needs to be one that respects the UN Charter, that respects Ukraine's territorial integrity, Ukraine's sovereignty. And, India is a strategic partner with whom we engage in a full and frank dialogue, and that includes on our concerns about their relationship with Russia.
Was it?
So
Erdogan has made clear.
So I will look to Prime Minister Modi's public remarks to see what he talked about. But as I said, we made quite clear directly with India our concerns about their relationship with Russia, and so we would hope India and any other country, when they engage with Russia, would make clear that Russia should respect the UN Charter, should respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Very sorry to be late. I don't have anything to say.
And then finally, of course, you also had a major reaction coming in from President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine. This was actually a fairly critical response because, of course, Ukraine has been fighting for its territory with Russia for the last 2.5 years. And President Zelensky coming out and making a tweet, talking about how Russia has, conducted another sort of bombing campaign and the human cost of that. And in that tweet, he also mentions that it is, fairly shocking to see the leader of the world's largest democracy sort of meeting and hugging President Putin. So this was definitely a very, very critical comment by the Ukrainian president. Remember that Prime Minister Modi just met President Zelensky on the sidelines of the G7 summit. And of course, Ukraine has in the past been very, very clear about the fact that it has not been very happy about India's contacts with Russia, India's relationship with Russia, India's continued purchase of Russian oil. Of course, President Zelensky's statement there, I think, of course, is definitely going to add a slight bit of a bitter note to India's relationship with Ukraine. But both sides understand the other's position. But absolutely, so two reactions coming in so far. One from the U.S. State Department, much more subdued, and the other one, of course, from President Zelensky, which is, I think, a little more critical, a little more disappointed with India's decision to have such a publicly bonhomie sort of meeting with the Russian president. But that's all that we have for you right now. We will absolutely get you details as soon as we get them. Like I mentioned, there's probably going to be a briefing on both sides, so we'll absolutely keep bringing that to you. So keep watching our channel. We're also going to let you know what the major details are in terms of the agreements that were reached between the two sides. And of course, later in the day, Prime Minister Narendra Modi is going to head to Austria. So we'll also come to you live. You'll see me again. And I'll tell you a little bit about why Prime Minister Modi is headed to Austria, what exactly he's looking to do there. And we'll have another chat later. Thank you so much for watching India Today Global. This is Shashank Matu.